I'd been thinking about law school for a little over a year at that point, ever since I was jury foreman on a murder trial. Uh, and
That's wild.
they basically convinced me. They were like, at least go take the LSAT and then
Yeah.
just see. And so I went home. I think it was like a Tuesday or Wednesday. The LSAT was that Saturday. So I went to Barnes and Noble and took a practice test, took the LSAT, and then started applying for law schools.
This is unhinged. Unhinged. The proceeds of this monetized episode are going towards I Am Dying Out Loud. Find out more in the description. Andrew Seidel, thank you so much for joining me today. I know that your life has probably been an absolute wild ride, and that's just what is visible on my end. I can't even imagine all the minutia that we don't see. So I really appreciate you being here. And I know that you booked this out like a month ago, so I know that you've just got a lot going on. But I really wanted to talk to you because when I found out that you were going to be one of the speakers at the Secular Student Alliance, I did a little digging into your background, and I just thought you had one of the most fascinating bios I'd ever read. And then when I saw you deliver your presentation, I was even more fascinated because I just thought the subject matter was important, but it's also entertaining, but it's also it's hard to describe just how important what it is that you do. So enough from me. Why don't you tell us in your own words what it is that you do, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I spend my days defending the Constitution, defending the separation of church and state, which is the only true guarantee that any of us has for religious freedom and really the freedom of thought. I spend my day standing up to religious bullies who want to use government power to impose their personal religion on other people or on other people's children, a captive audience of school children in a public school, right? So this is what I spend my time doing, fighting for a principle that is bigger than myself. And to me, the fight for the separation of church and state is really, I think, the fight of our times. I've been in the trenches on the front lines for more than a decade now, and I've seen how much of an impact this has, and I've seen people wake up to realize the importance of it as we are seeing the Supreme Court take it away from us. Yes. I mean, that's my basic gist. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Just
like
little small stuff.
The craziest part is, people, I don't think people understand what a dangerous time this is right now for religious rights and freedoms and the freedom of speech and the ability to, because when people think religious freedoms, I think they automatically think Christian freedoms. I think they automatically think being able to, religious freedoms, that means being able to hold hands around the flag and pray at my high school. But what it actually means is being able to say, no, I would rather not hold hands around the flag and pray just because the football coach said to do it, or I would rather wear my hijab in class, thank you very much, or I'm not religious at all and I don't want to say under God and like pray, with my school. But one of the most interesting things was, because you fight for this so hard, one of the most interesting things about your bio, I meant to say, is because you fight for this so hard, I thought to myself, when people fight for something this hard, it's usually because they've had a personal experience of some sort with either having those rights taken away or not being able to express themselves in a certain way, and now that's kind of their main focus. Would you say that's true about anything you've experienced in your life, or did you grow up religious?
That's really interesting. I mean, you touched on a couple things that are so important there, and I will answer the personal question too. But we're at this really fascinating and awful point in American history right now, where we're seeing religious freedom be weaponized. And if you ask people what religious freedom means, it depends on who is doing the asking and who you are asking.
Yes.
It's the speaker and the audience. And, so for instance, if you tell people Trump said religious freedom and you tell that to an audience of Republicans, they think that means Christian privilege.
Right.
It becomes this really fascinating, but what we're seeing really is the weaponization of religious freedom.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's one of the other things that I do is write books, and I wrote a book that just came out about that called American Crusade. But yeah, this is not just my career, right? At the moment, I'm working at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I just finished my first year there. It's a wonderful organization that's been doing this kind of work for more than 75 years, right? Fighting for freedom without favor and equality without exception, right? That is something I can get behind, that I love. Before that, I was doing this fight for 10 years at another organization. In my personal time, I get up at 5 a.m. every day and I write books or I write law review articles. When I'm not working or up early writing, I'm tweeting about this. I'm trying to make videos on TikTok to educate people. Like, this is what I do. And the reason is not so much that I had a formative experience with this. I'm happy to get into that. It's that I see the separation of church and state connecting to every other issue that I care about.
Yes. Yes.
Whether it is racial justice, LGBTQ equality, abortion rights, a chance to actually fight the climate crisis, a scientific response to a pandemic,
Yes.
strong public schools that teach sex education and evolution and just basic things that we need to have a functioning society. All the through line through all of the issues that I care about is having a robust separation between religion and government.
Yes.
And when that falls down, when we see this creeping Christian nationalism, this rising Christian nationalism, and when we start to lose that separation of church and state, we're not just losing all of those things, we're losing democracy and pluralism. And so
Yes.
if we don't fight back against it, if we don't relegate it back to the fringe, the America that we aspire to will always be a dream.
Yes.
That really is why I'm in this fight, because I see it as connecting to absolutely every other thing that I care about, from our democracy down to every other issue you can think of.
And then you have people on camera in front of entire audiences of people saying, members of our government saying, let's get rid of all that separation of church and state junk. Mm-hmm. You're like, I'm sorry, junk? You mean the laws of this country? That junk? It's just wild. And
it is.
I think also there is part of the lack of understanding comes from, or the lack of seeing how important it is, comes from a lot of the states where the majority of people are Christians. So they don't see a problem with the football team being asked to pray. They don't see a problem with the like pre-game rally having a prayer. Like, of course, that's fine. But I look back in hindsight and I remember they would have like gather at the flagpole. And I remember thinking, like, I don't really want to go, but everyone's going. And if I'm not seen there, maybe, it looks like I hate Christianity or I hate God. So I guess I'll go. And how that was probably illegal, probably, right? Like, even though nobody held a gun to my head and said, you go pray at that flag or else, just the idea that my teachers might look at me differently if they see me sitting in the cafeteria on their way out to pray at the flagpole. Even small things like that, those moments are what I feel like slowly over time we let people get away with them, and then the next thing you know, politicians are saying, let's get rid of that church and state separation junk, and it happens that fast. Do you find that you get the most pushback from people who don't think that Christianity is a problem and they think you're being anti-Christian? Or do you get the most pushback from people who want Christianity to stay in power, they're well aware of what they're doing, and they want you to shut up?
I think there are certainly elements from both of those, right?
Yeah.
There is an intentional slander that the separation of church and state is anti-religion, when the truth is that you cannot have the freedom of religion without a government that's free from religion. If you
Right.
want true religious freedom, that requires a secular government, right? If the government can tell you how to pray or recommend that you pray, you do not have religious freedom.
No.
Now, as you pointed out, when they're saying pray to your God, most people are okay with it. It's only when they're saying pray to a different God that they start to realize, oh, this is actually a problem.
Yes.
And to me, look, the wall of separation between church and state is an American original, right? That is an American invention. The idea was floating around in the ether of the Enlightenment, but it was born and first implemented in the American experiment. Until then, no other nation in the history of the world had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. Now, there's a lot to be ashamed of in our Constitution, but that is something that we can be
Yes.
proud of. And we shouldn't let people undermine it with myths about a Christian founding. And, I mean, one of the things that, as we've been talking, that I've been thinking about is, you asked me about my upbringing and like what motivates me. And two of the things that I was taught early on by my parents, by my mom, really were to question authority, even if it got me in trouble, and it did with decent frequency in school. Teachers don't necessarily like it when you call them out. And the other was to not stand quietly by when you see injustice.
Right.
To stand up to bullies, to stand up to people who have power over others and are abusing it or abusing those others. And those two lessons are lessons that I took to heart, and I think they are probably two of the driving forces in my entire life, and almost certainly led to this particular niche career where they overlap pretty
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also one of the most insidious, and feel free to disagree with anything I say openly, just be like, "No, that's
Oh,
bullshit."
I will. Yeah.
Yeah, please do. Like, I forget to tell people, like, I'm a former debater, like, do it. But I think one of the most insidious things about specifically the chokehold that Christianity has on the American culture, American lawmakers, the Republican Party, is that it's it's so easy for them to say things like, "What's wrong with having students pray? What's wrong with that? It won't hurt them. Nobody's ever been hurt being asked to pray. If anything, it'll help them. There's nothing wrong with prayer." It's like no different than meditation. But what these people don't understand is that the same exact people who push prayer in schools or anything like that, they also very likely push purity culture, and they very likely push harmful stereotypes about things like people who follow Islam or people who grew up Jewish. It's like, it's not just a kid's not going to get hurt for praying. It's There are so many harmful attachments that come with these sets of beliefs that don't belong in the school system. Christianity shouldn't get to dictate what type of sex ed, if any at all, gets to happen in the church. Like, Christianity shouldn't get to dictate not only the laws in this country, because not everyone's Christian, but also the idea that Christians claim that the platform they have is that they were born with the freedom to choose, but we slowly see these freedoms being taken away from fellow Americans. The whole idea is that God gave us the ability to choose right from wrong, the ability to choose our path, the ability to choose what we're going to do, who we're going to follow. And yet, when more and more people stand up and say, we're not going to follow the way of Jesus or the way of God, they suddenly make it more and more difficult, either legally or educationally or however, to not follow those rules. And so it doesn't even make a lot of sense inherently to say, like, you tell me on Sunday that God gives me the right to choose, and yet when I choose the side that you don't like, you take away my freedom to continue to choose that. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's very insidious, and it happens so quietly under the surface. And yet nowadays, I feel like it's no longer even under the surface. It's just a blatant issue now. They're saying it on TV, they're saying it on the radio, they're saying it on podcasts, they're saying it on Fox News and CNN, and it's becoming the norm, which is so dangerous.
I mean, they're certainly saying the quiet part out loud. And to take your first example in that, the children in a public school already can pray if they want to. Kids are free to pray in school. Like, there's an
There's
old
no
joke that
school that's
every
banning
politician,
prayer.
yeah, there's every politician you've ever heard has told this joke about how as long as there's math tests in public schools, there's going to be prayer, right? Like, kids can pray if they want. We're not talking about
Yes.
kids praying. We're
Right.
talking about the government organizing and imposing prayer on other
Yes.
people's children. And
Exactly.
that is a problem that everybody should be pissed off about. And I think that gets to your point that, like, there's all these other things that are attached with it. It's a giveaway, right? Because
Yes.
students already have that freedom. It's not about that freedom. It's not about
Right.
letting students pray. It's about coercing them into prayer.
Yes.
And this, the second point that I think you touched on, that I think is just so important, that's often missed in this discussion, is that the separation of church and state shields our laws from the influence of any one religion. And that is what frees us to come together as equals and build a stronger democracy. And I just want to give you one example of that from a recent
Sure.
case that Americans United took, because I think it's really, really important. This is a case that we filed in Missouri about the abortion ban in Missouri. And when Missouri legislators passed the abortion ban, they wrote into the law, Almighty God is the author of life. Not only did they write that into the actual law book, the text of the statute, they said the quiet part out loud when they were passing the law on the floor of the Missouri legislature. They said things like, my God doesn't give us a choice in this matter, and being from the biblical side of it, and Psalms 119 this, and as a Catholic that, right? They were clear that they were abusing their power to impose their personal religion on everybody else. And
Yes.
that is exactly what the separation of church and state is designed to stop and designed to protect against. And that is bullying in the worst
Yes.
shape and form, I think. And that's the
Yes.
kind of thing that I'm always going to stand up for,
Yes.
against, rather.
Yes. Yeah, and I saw somebody tweet the other day. I think it was a comedian that I know who said part of being on the side of the furthest right is making up things that have never happened and then passing laws about it. And I was thinking about that one day, and we were walking around downtown Nashville, and there's this bar where in big red letters it says, "We proudly serve troops," in like big aggressive letters. And I looked at my partner and I said, is there a bar here that's not serving troops? I said, is there
Yeah,
a bar here who's saying, get the fuck out of here, you
yeah.
soldier? And I feel like that's the prayer thing. I'm so glad you made that distinction. It's not about allowing students to pray. Everybody's allowed to pray. There's people out here who think that we're taking God out of children's lives when they step into school. That's not what we're doing. We're saying school is one place, church is another place. You are welcome to pray over your math test as much as you want. I tried, it didn't work. I'm just saying, I think that was the beginning of my atheist career, probably. But like, you are allowed to do that. You're allowed to. The problem is the child who is a member of the Nation of Islam, he also gets to pray if he wants to. You know, he gets to respect his religion if he wants to. He has the right to do that. But what doesn't get to happen is the school doesn't get to hire a speaker from First Baptist Church to come in and talk to the students about why God's grace is so important. That doesn't get to happen. And again, it's so easy for people who are either already Christian or they don't have a problem with Christianity to say, why is that such a problem? Because it's hard for me to like express what a problem that is, because even if you are the most devout Christian, even if you wake up and you pray every single day and you go to church, you should be upset about the idea that the school is bringing these people in to speak about God, to speak about religion, to lead a student prayer. You should be upset about that, about the mandated aspect of religion. And the idea that if everyone in the school is being asked to participate in Christian activities, what is that saying to any of the children that aren't Christian? It's saying you're wrong. It's saying you don't belong here. It's saying join us or be, stick out like a sore thumb. It's saying a lot of different things. And everyone should be mad about it. Everyone should be upset and arguing against religion being so heavily indoctrinated into the school system and the curriculum.
And there's another reason too, I think that we can put a finer point on it, is that it violates their religious freedom as well to have the
Mhm.
government come in and impose a religion that's not their own,
Right.
or even a religion that is their own, right? I mean, one of the things that the founders did that we don't talk about a whole lot, especially on the atheist side of the state-church separation, is that there was an element of protecting churches and protecting religion from the government too. James Madison said that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they're mixed together. He said that when religion is used as an engine of public policy, which is what we're talking about, right? Protecting our shared laws from the influence of any one religion, right? When religion is used as an engine of public policy, it's an unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation, right? Like if you care about your religion and its purity, then you ought to be against the government being the one coming around and imposing it and interpreting it, right?
Yes.
We just saw in Texas this past legislative term, the Texas legislature tried to pass a law that would put the Ten Commandments in every public school in Texas. Okay, they wrote a version of the Ten Commandments, and it's not a version of the Ten Commandments that you can find in any Bible, right? They edited it to their own particular Texas approved version of Ten Commandments that you cannot find. They were writing Holy Scripture. They were defining what Holy Scripture is and then saying it must go up in every public school. Every Christian in America should have been pissed off about that.
Pissed. Yes.
But because we see this rising Christian nationalism, because they care more about power than they do about their religion, or at least more about power in the United States and in the here and now, they're willing to put those, I don't know, abuses of their religion, we might say, aside in the pursuit of power. It's really and that I think is the extra element of Christian nationalism that we've seen waves of in America throughout our history, and we're really battling back a wave of right now.
Yeah. I remember when I first moved here to Tennessee, um, big fat red flag that just about every other job I applied for asked for a pastoral reference.
Oh
Every single
yeah,
one of them. They asked for a
yeah.
pastoral reference. And even like again, I used to be a devout Christian. Even then, I don't want to tell you that information because that's none of your business. Like that shouldn't be
Yeah.
anybody's business. Unless I'm applying to be a pastor, I don't think you need to talk to my pastor. And if you're Baptist, you don't think I should be a pastor anyway. I remember those lessons. But yeah, it starts small and then it just like you said, then they just start saying the quiet part out loud. And
Mhm.
what I think, man, I've just got so many thoughts that are like spilling out of my head. I think that what we're running into is first it started with Christianity is not so bad. Like, do you mind if we just do it here? And then it became, you sure you don't want to do this with us? Whether it's at work, whether it's at school, whether it's in your job, whether it's just out in public. And then it became, oh, you don't want to do it? Why not? Oh, that's odd. And now it's, we are literally rewriting the 10 commandments to suit our benefit. We are passing laws in states that quote God as like a legal entity as opposed to a religious entity. And it just explodes from there. What would you say is one of the most common issues that are reported to you or that you find that your organization explores the most if you had to pick?
Yeah, I mean, public schools. There's so much that happens in public schools, from the assaults generally that we're seeing on public schools, the attempt to defund them with vouchers, to funnel money to private Christian schools instead, which is real. I mean, that's really a fight that dates back to the days of Brown versus Board of Education, when schools were integrated for the first time. You saw the rise of these segregation academies that then found homes in Christian churches, to try to maintain those segregated schools. And that is when you first see the school choice movement created in the United States of America. That's what school choice was really all about. It was keeping schools white. And one of the best ways to do that was church schools, Christian schools. And I write about this quite a bit in the new book. There's other, of course, like more compared to that, more minor aspects where you do have, teachers encouraging students to pray. The case of the football coach that was imposing his personal prayer on other people's kids at the 50-yard line of his games that the Supreme Court wrongly decided last term. That was a case brought by Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, the organization I work for. That public schools really are a battleground, and because they've been a target of Christian nationalists and before Christian nationalists, known as the quote religious right for a long time. It's a place that they see, they call them government schools, and they see them as corrupting their children. The homeschool movement is another part of this as well. I mean, it really is, I think, ground zero, and it's been the bullseye for the Christian nationalists for a long, long time. So that's probably if I had to pick the issue that we see the most, it's a little bit of a dodge because I'm including so many in it, but public schools.
But I mean, that's the sad part, is that there are so many. That's why I'm having trouble formulating thoughts that I've been thinking about for weeks, because there's just so many issues here. And so random question, but I read that you studied neuroscience.
Yes.
So how do you go from studying neuroscience to being a lawyer defending the First Amendment and the separation of church and state? How did that happen? That was one of the reasons I was like, I got to talk to you, because I don't understand how you make that transition.
Yeah, neuroscience was so cool. So I got a Bachelor of Science in Neuroscience and Environmental Science when I was at Tulane University for undergrad. And I loved it so much because it was, I remember one of my teachers coming in and saying, hey, so everything we've been learning for the past 6 weeks about this and this and this, turns out we were totally wrong. We just got the results of all these experiments back, and here's what we really know. And it was just so cool to be in a cutting edge major where you're actually learning about these things as they're happening, right?
In real time.
In real time, yeah. And there's so many fascinating aspects of it. Think about we think about our minds, but how does your mind reflected in the physical structures of the brain and the neurons? How do you actually learn? It's actually neurons making connections with other neurons, or expanding those connections, making them essentially a little bit able to flow a little bit faster. It may be a way to think about it. It was an amazing major. I was going to be a doctor. When I went to college, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to help people that way. I was going to do trauma work, working in ER. That was what I really wanted to do. I did a lot of that. I did all the pre-med requirements. I was actually
really.
Yep, I was an EMT for a while. I worked in hospitals for a long time, and I liked it. I liked the helping people part of it. I really liked the on the ground with the patients aspects of those things. But I learned the medical system more and more, and kind of the higher up you get, the more disconnected you are from patients. And I sort of got a little disenchanted with the system altogether. I was kind of looking around for something else, and I was like, okay, well, I'll save the environment. That's what I'll do. I'll save the world. Just why not? And so I also picked up an environmental science degree, and I did a lot of work there. And that's when I went out west to kind of try to figure out what I was going to do in that respect, how I was going to help save the world. And while I was trying to figure that out, I was a Grand Canyon tour guide.
Huh,
and
no way. See what I mean? This wildness.
Yeah, I mean, it was still, I gotta say, I love my job right now, and I love the fight I'm in, but that might be the coolest job I'll ever have in my life.
I was gonna say, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, I've seen the canyon every way you can see it. I did some hiking tours. I did a guided rafting tour a couple times. I was the lowest person on the river. I've done mostly though, what I would do is that where the money was you would do the day trips. You pick up a van of people in like Flagstaff and drive them up to the canyon, give them the tour of all the stuff on the South Rim, and drop them back off in Flagstaff in the evening. But the hiking tours were really a lot of fun. I mean, it's an amazing place, and so many formative, just truly awesome experiences. And I had a couple in my van that I was kind of talking to. I think there was only 4 people in the van that day, and one of them was this married couple, and they were both environmental lawyers. I don't know who that. One of these days, I'm like hoping they'll hear me somewhere and be like, we are the couple. I don't know who they were, but they basically, like, I had been thinking about law school. I'd been thinking about law school for a little over a year at that point, ever since I was jury foreman on a murder trial. And
That's wild.
They basically convinced me. They were like, at least go take the LSAT and then just see. And so I went home. I think it was like a Tuesday or Wednesday. The LSAT was that Saturday. So I went to Barnes and Noble and took a practice test, took the LSAT, and then started applying for law schools.
This is unhinged. This is unhinged.
Yeah. I mean, so that's how I ended up in law school. And I went to law school I was like, I'm going to do environmental law. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do international environmental law, because I'm going to fucking stop climate change. I'm going to use the law to stop climate change. That was what I wanted to do. And as I was in law school, I was learning, really kind of for the first time, everybody knows about the First Amendment, but it's much different when you're approaching it from a professional perspective and
totally
really studying it, and and you're breaking it down into the speech clause and into the assembly clause and into the religion clauses. Yes. And just really, really fascinating stuff. And this was around the time too. This was, I was in law school from 2006 to 2009. So this is around the time that, all those huge atheism books kind of broke into the mainstream for the first time ever. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm an atheist. At that point, I had always been. I just never really like called myself that. I wasn't something that I was particularly one way or another about, but learning more and more about it. I'm happy to talk about like how that happened to me from my childhood, but that kind of the intersection of those two things, and learning about Christian, what we now realize is Christian nationalism, and I think that's the appropriate label for it. And totally. Seeing how much harm it was doing, and connecting those dots that we already talked about, connecting, while I was in law school, I'm like, man, maybe this is what I need to be doing with my career. And I continued on doing the environmental law stuff. I actually got a second law degree in international environmental law. I did a fellowship in that. I wrote a guidebook that literally nobody is ever going to read. You can't find it, so don't even bother Googling. And I was kind of at this crossroads where I got a good offer in environmental law to start. Basically, it wasn't nonprofit, so it's not 100% what I wanted to do, but to start a firm that would have been doing wind and water and weed in southern Colorado, which would have been a big deal, would have been good money too. Or go work at the Freedom from Religion Foundation and fight religious bullies for a living. Mm-hmm. And I kind of really wanted to do the FFRF gig. But I was struggling with it. And I was talking to my sister. And she said, Andrew, how many lawyers out there do like environmental law? Aren't there like kind of a lot? And I was like, yeah, there's thousands, like really talented, brilliant, like much smarter than I am. She's like, how many people do this other thing? I was like 4? I don't know. And the answer is less than 20, and I know them all very well. We're all good friends right now. Yeah. And she's like, I think you'll have a much bigger impact there. And then she's like, and the way you're talking about it. And then we had this conversation about how it connects to every other issue that we care about. And she's like, what about environmental law? And I'm like, oh, absolutely environmental law. And she's like, really? How? And like, this was right around the time there was a guy in the House, she's still there last I checked, Representative Shimkus from Illinois, who was the head of one of the science panels in the House. And I remember this so vividly. It was during a hearing. He said, you can Google this and you will find it, I'm sure. He said, listen, we don't have to worry about global climate change. God promised Noah he was not going to flood the earth again. And right, this is the guy who is defining climate policy and science policy for the House of Representatives, citing the Bible as a reason we don't need to worry about it. Right. So, yeah, the separation of church and state has a thing or two to say about environmental law and climate change.
It's like, then why, sir, do we live in a microwave? Out of curiosity, if that promise was
How
made.
come I can't go outside?
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, after that, I took the FFRF job, and I've not looked back since.
Yeah, and you're
100% the
still
right call.
involved with them, right?
I mean, I work for the Americans United for Separation of Church and State right now. I was with FFRF for 10 years. I still have a ton of friends there. The people that I worked alongside there were some of the most devoted and talented people I've ever had the good fortune to know. I count them all very close friends. And I am speaking at the FFRF convention in October. So.
Interesting. And so for people who are listening to this and they're not like us, they don't read about this stuff all the time obsessively, how would you describe Christian nationalism and the difference between being a Christian nationalist and just being proud of being an American?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, I think, important question. Christian nationalism, first of all, it's an existential threat to the American Republic. It's fundamentally opposed to democracy and pluralism. And one of the things that I like to ask people is, do we have a government of the people, for the people, and by the people? Or is ours a government of the Christians, for the Christians, and by the Christians? Because that's the battle that we're in right now.
That's a really good question.
It is. I mean, we're in a desperate fight against Christian nationalism, which you can define it a whole bunch of different ways. And, I've got Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, who are these close friends who are sociologists who've written a great book on it, and Robbie Jones, who studies it. They're sociologists, they're academics studying it. But I like to think of it as it's a political theology that is an existential threat to our republic. And the first book I wrote was called "The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American," and it's not often that came out in 2019, and so it's not often that you choose a subtitle and then the subject of it runs out to prove you right by assaulting democracy and fomenting an insurrection. But I mean, that's what happened on January 6th. And
literally,
it's not just the insurrection, right? White Christian nationalism it's a claim. It's the claim that America was founded as a Christian nation, that our laws and government are based on Christian or sometimes Judeo-Christian principles. And most importantly, that we've strayed from that foundation, right? We've gotten away from our godly roots. Yep. And so they use the language of return, of getting back to those roots, to justify public policy and insurrections. And it's things that you remember, like the Muslim ban, right? I mean, that's Christian nationalism in print. The child separation policy at the border, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions justified that by pointing to Romans 13. Yes. Right? He learned how to do that in the White House Bible study. There's this group called Project Blitz, which is this statewide shadow network that was formed explicitly to push Christian nationalist bills. And Americans United has been on the front lines of fighting Project Blitz. I think it's the one last thing I'll say about Christian nationalism is that it's really important. It is not a scholarly debate about how our country was founded or our history. That's what people thought of it for a long time, right? Like, America was founded as a Christian nation. No, it wasn't. Like, that's how it kind of manifested itself. But it really is this sinister exclusionary movement, and it rewrites our history in an attempt to redefine America according to the Christian nationalist identity.
Yes.
And then they're going to reshape the law accordingly, so that to be an American is to be a Christian, and to be a Christian is to be an American. And really what we're talking about there is the right kind of Christian, right? Like, exactly. You got to be the right kind of, you got to be white, conservative, cis, het Christian man. Like, that's who we're talking about. And the end goal is that the law will protect them, that favored group, but not bind them. And the law will bind everybody else, but not protect them. And if you want to make sense of what the fucking Supreme Court has been doing for the last 2 years, that is what it has been doing.
That's such a good way to put it. The people who it protects are not bound by it. The people bound by it are not protected by it. Like, boom, That is like that is the most boiled down way I've ever heard that explained. Brilliant. And what I try to tell people who are Christians about Christian nationalism is I'm like, you should also be mad about this too, because Christian nationalists also really don't care about other Christians. It's all about themselves. And if you are truly a Christian and you see them passing laws that you don't agree with, treating people in ways that you don't agree with, rewriting the 10 Commandments in the state of Texas, and you don't agree with that, you should also be mad about Christian nationalism. Because again,
Not just
it
be
doesn't,
mad, but speaking out against it
yes,
too.
actively speaking out against it. Silence is compliance. If you don't tell anybody that you have an issue with it, you don't have an issue with it. And another thing people don't understand is existential threats become material threats. They become physical threats. So, laws are laws. Sure, they're on paper. They're trying to get these rules passed. But then the next thing you know, you wake up and you can't get an abortion. Or if you do, you might serve the death penalty in some of these states. These existential threats become real threats, and they become real, true physical threats. Like they're real is not the right word. Real threats are also existential threats, but they become actual physical threats that are now enacted. And like you said, you are not protected. You are bound by these new threats that are very real, and now they're legal. It's wild that people can't see that.
Yeah, and I also like to take a moment here to plug. Well, let me actually. I did one of the things I'm most proud of in my career is I helped spearhead a report on the role that Christian nationalism played in the January 6th insurrection, and I was writing an epilogue for The Founding Myth, my first book, about January 6th, and there was so much there. There was the ties between Christian nationalism were so copious and obvious, and my publisher was like, "You get 3,000 words," and I was like, "How about you give me 30,000?" And they were like, "That's a third of your book. We can't do that."
Yeah.
So there's all this extra stuff there, and I was like, "We have to tell this story. Where am I going to tell it?" So I did the epilogue, and then I reached out to my friend Amanda Tyler, who runs the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty,
Mm.
and Amanda's a devout Christian, and she runs something called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I said,
Interesting.
and I said, Amanda, like,
Write that down.
there's all this stuff here. Let's get together, like our friends, like the experts that we know, and let's do a joint report and publish this and get the word out, and let's get Congress involved. And that's what we did. And so we put together this report with Jamar Tisby, who is a devout Christian, who wrote about the difference between white Christian nationalism and how what you might call Black Christian nationalism, but really how Black Americans understand what would be called a Christian nation. Anthea Butler, who's a brilliant historian at the University of Pennsylvania of American history and American religion. Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead, who I mentioned earlier. Catherine Stewart, who's one of the foremost experts on kind of the shadowy network of power that underlies the Christian nationalist movement. We put together this awesome report that got a ton of notice in Congress. All of us were asked to testify, to submit written testimony to the January 6th committee as a result, which we all did.
Wow.
And Amanda ended up going and doing some testimony as well as the leader of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Like, this report really made a splash, and part of it was because she is a Christian who's out there speaking out against Christian nationalism. And if you're a Christian and you're listening to this and you want to do that, I would really encourage you to get involved with that group as well.
Yeah. And how would you recommend people get involved?
I mean, I think there's a couple of different things that people can do. I mean, the number one thing I would encourage everybody to do is to join Americans United. That's at au.org. If you're not necessarily into joining, you could sign the pledge that we have going on right now, the One Nation All Beliefs Pledge, which is au.org/pledge. You can see how this issue connects to everything else. I mean, that's one of the number one things that people can do. The other thing is that Christian nationalism, it is an entire identity that is based around disinformation.
Right.
And you can combat disinformation, but you have to have the right arguments and the right tools to do that. And the reason I wrote both of my books was that is why, right? I wanted people, the Founding Myth is all about giving people not just the facts that they need, but the better arguments to actually convince people and to change minds. And there are plenty of minds you're never going to change, but there are plenty in the squishy middle who you can change and who you can wake up to the danger of the threat that we face, which is, I think, one of the main goals that we have to have. But I mean, the thing that I really encourage people to do is just, you cannot be silent. As you said earlier, silence is compliance. It's much easier to sit silently and let these things pass and not get involved. But eventually it's going to come to you. Because if you are not a member of that favored group, the conservative, white, cis-het Christian men who the law protects, they're coming for you. Christian nationalism is coming for all of us.
Yes. And I remember reading an article about how the far right Christian nationalist women are very disappointed in the way that Christian nationalist men are treating them on dating apps and out in the world. And you're like, why are you surprised by this? If they're going to stop.
I'm shocked to hear that there's gambling going on in this establishment.
I am shocked. What nationalists that don't respect women? I am utterly shook. I'm just, but yeah, it's a scary time that we're living in, but I also feel like it's one of the most perfect times for all of this to be coming up, because we have now so many platforms to get the message out, to get these ideas out. We have TikTok, we have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have we can build websites. Now, the problem is that also means that people out here nefariously, intentionally spreading misinformation have just as many platforms to share that information. But you're right. It's this idea of, if you aren't speaking out about it, you're basically supporting it in the eyes of the movement. And I'm not saying that people have to turn their entire TikTok accounts into anti-Christian nationalist stuff, but I heard a phrase recently where they said, if there are 10 people at a table and one of them is a Nazi and the other 9 people don't say anything against the Nazi, there are 10 Nazis at that table. And I feel the same way about remaining silent when there are opportunities, big or small, to speak out against these things, or at least to take a personal stance against them. If anything, even if they don't sign up on websites, even if they don't buy t-shirts about it, even if they don't, fill their library full of books to educate themselves about it, if people around you don't know how you feel about the subject, maybe now would be the perfect time to start letting people know how you feel about the subject.
And if you want to deal a double blow to the Christian nationalists, don't fill your library with the books. Go to your library and borrow the books about Christian nationalism. They hate that. And can I just take a moment to offer a little hope too, because I do think, especially in conversations like this, it's important.
Yeah, totally.
Because I give these, I do talks like this all the time, and one of the things I get asked a lot at the end is like, do you actually have hope? And I really do.
Yeah.
The wellspring of my hope is this basic definitional truth. Their power-hungry aggression is growing our movement.
Yes.
Right. Their wins, like in the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe versus Wade, in the coach imposing prayer on other people's children, and in the affirmative action, and all the things that have just gone to shit, it seems like lately. In the 303 creative case that the Supreme Court decided today, their wins swell our ranks.
Yes.
And what they're actually doing is creating a feedback loop, because the why of Christian nationalism, why are they turning to strong men? Why are they turning to this Christian nation? Why are they turning to the January 6th insurrection? Is because they are seeing the power and privilege and deference that they are used to slipping away.
Yes.
And white Christian nationalists are working to privilege the chosen few. So every legislative and legal victory that they notch, by definition, alienates more people, wakes more people up to the danger, and drives more people away from their movement.
Yes.
Right. So they are crusading because we are working to meet the unmet promise in the American Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, right? The self-evident truth that all are equal, that we the people means all the people. And previous generations have failed to realize those aspirations, right? Leaving it to their children to contend with human tragedies like slavery and segregation and the subjugation of women and discrimination against LGBTQ people and now the climate crisis. And as we march toward that progress, Christian nationalists are fighting ever harder against it, that they
Yes.
will not go gently. They will rage against the dying of their privilege. But in the end, we will win. And that's
Yes.
because they fight only for themselves.
Yep.
And where they are selfish, we can be selfless. They want supremacy, we want equality. And that's why in the end, we will triumph. Not because our principle is inherently better than theirs, though it is.
Don't make no mistake.
It is. We're right.
Yeah.
They're wrong. But because the math is on our side, right? We have the numbers. And that's what they are fighting. That's
Yes.
what they are raging against. And yeah, you can fight City Hall, but you can't fight math. And so I really do have hope. I really, really do.
Yeah, and I think now more hope than ever, because it's very similar, talking about these things all the time. It makes you sound like you don't have any hope, but I've actually never, I don't think ever had more hope than I do now. And I think you hit the nail on the head. People don't fight tooth and nail against a problem that isn't there. Well, I say that, but then I remember Republicans do that actually all the time. But like when they present these laws, when they present these bills, when they present these ideas, it's because, like you said, they see the antithesis gaining power and they see the antithesis becoming more successful and getting larger in number. And while it is terrible when we have things like today, decisions being made in the highest courts of this nation that are against our better good, I suppose I should say, we should also recognize that these are fear actions. These are actions coming from people that are quaking in their boots because the way of life that they cherish, that they love, that works best for them is on the decline. And they're doing whatever they can to make it a rule even far beyond the day that they die. And so I think it's actually a great sign that they're fighting so hard. And I've never had more faith in a generation than I have in Gen Z, because you want to talk about activists. I've seen them do stuff. They weren't even old enough to vote, and I saw them wreak havoc in the last election. It's just wild to watch, and I have nothing but faith in them. But also, I never want to get to the point where I have so much faith that I'm complacent and I don't feel like I need to be nearly as active or say anything because everybody else has got it. We're doing great. Because you have 2016 elections all over again, where
I'm glad you said that. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, like, I think that's such an important extra point. It's worth emphasizing. Like, I'm so impressed by this younger generation. I'm so pissed that it's falling to them, and I feel like everybody's saying, like, they're going to be the ones to save us. It's like, well, let's help them. Let's not just say
they
they're going
have
to do let's do as much as we fucking can to help them first. So I appreciate that very much.
It's like, don't get me wrong, they're doing great, but only because they literally have to. Otherwise, shit is like burning to the ground. They want to continue to live in this country. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and I know that we're scheduled to go till right about now. So if you had just a piece of advice for somebody listening to this, whether they're Christian, whether they're not, whether they're Muslim, whether they're atheist, and maybe they're young, early 20s, or maybe they're not young, but they're just kind of finding out about all this for the first time for whatever reason, what advice would you give them on how to stay strong and how to make their voice heard?
I mean, you make your voice heard by speaking up. You make your voice heard by voting. I do think that's absolutely crucial. And yes, sometimes voting is choosing the lesser of two evils and not being excited about the choice. That's what it means. Like, also, you're never going to fully agree with any candidate you vote for. If that's what you need to vote for somebody, then you need to be running for office, which I would also encourage everybody listening to do. Run for something. And Run for Something is also a good organization to help you run for something. I mean, I think arming yourself with knowledge in this fight is also just absolutely a key, and getting out there and having these debates and not sitting quietly by. And I mean, not everybody wants to be in the trenches fighting. That's perfectly okay. Speaking up is more than enough. And if you can't do any of those things, you can certainly donate to candidates and organizations that can do those things on your behalf. And one of my favorite things to say is just I think keeping this in mind, America will never be a Christian nation, because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Leave it at that.
Well, Andrew, I really appreciate your time and
Yeah, it
your
was fun.
opinions and your wisdom and for being here, because again, I know that you've got more, like you've got so much on your plate right now, and
Believe it or not, it's 9 p.m. I'm going to do another interview after this. Believe it or not,
really,
this is my life. Yes, yes.
that's wild. Well, I love that this is one of them. I appreciate you stopping by, and I will link your books below. I'll link all the websites that you mentioned below if people are interested in getting involved or reading your books. That will all be in whatever platform you're listening on. It'll be in the description. And yeah, Andrew, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. It was a pleasure to meet you finally.
My pleasure. Have a good one.